They showed up at 9 on a Saturday, smiles like they owned the street, two guys in cheap tactical vests, a woman in a blazer carrying a clipboard, and a little brass badge that looked like it had been bought online. All three acting like this was perfectly normal, like they were delivering mail or trimming hedges. And for a second I just watched because some part of me wanted to believe the calm morning would win out. But then the one with the clipboard said, sharp and polite, "We're here to enforce community standards." And everything that could be wrong about a quiet neighborhood stepped forward all at once. My name's Caleb Mercer, and for most of my life I've been good at fixing things: fences, leaky roofs, stubborn people who think rules are suggestions, which is to say I understand how small breaks turn into big ones when nobody pays attention. And that morning Willow Ridge looked like it was about to crack open over something stupid and petty. The woman Marla Hargrove was the HOA president, known for her neat hair and an inbox full of grievances. The two men, Ross and Hank, were strangers. They flashed a badge that didn't belong to any agency anyone here recognized and started reading off violations as if they'd been waiting for the perfect house to pounce on. They pointed at my neighbor's pickup, at a cracked mailbox, at a tarp on a trailer, and they expected compliance like a Sunday sermon. You don't need a uniform to bully people. You need confidence, a script, and a crowd that's too polite to interrupt. That's how it works. Marla relied on that politeness. She loved the words community standards the way some folks love him. She liked being the one who could say no to paint colors, to hedge heights, to backyard grills. Only this time she picked on someone who'd been in Willow Ridge long enough to remember when these houses were built by hands that called each other by name, and who'd been through enough to know when words were going to blow up into something worse. Caleb's not a show-off. I used to be part of something that taught you to count to 3 before you moved: military discipline. Years of the sort of training that makes your hands do what your head says, even when your heart is fizzing like a soda. Now I build porches and teach a kid down the block how to hang shelves without making the drywall cry. But the old training doesn't leave you, it just sits quiet until it's needed. That morning, I felt it like a low hum. I saw the men's hands drift to their vests, Ross smiling too wide, Hank's jaw tight. I heard Marla say, with the clipped, righteous tone she used at HOA meetings, "We can detain you for obstruction," and I saw the door of escalation open. You have to understand why Marla did it. Power is addictive, and small power especially is corrosive. She'd been shut out of neighborhood clout for years by people who didn't care what she wanted, and the HOA was her way back, a badge of relevance. The men she'd hired wanted money and control, and maybe the little thrill of seeing someone step down. That's the motive: vanity and money and the greed that smells like cheap cologne. The stakes were a cracked mailbox and a man's sense of dignity. But where that starts, worse things grow. I could see it in the neighbors leaning out of windows, in the couple on the porch pretending not to watch, in the way Marla addressed us like an audience. I stepped forward because nobody else would, and because I've always had this stupid faith that a little steady voice can change the rhythm of a scene. "You're not with the county," I said, quiet enough not to startle, loud enough to be heard. "You can't detain people like that." Ross laughed in that way bullies do when they're betting a crowd will back them. Hank shifted his weight. Marla flicked her eyes at me, annoyance, surprise, and calculation like I'd interrupted a script. What followed is the part people like to clip and call the showdown. And sure, there's a part of me that likes the neatness of it, but most of it was messy and human, and full of weird small moments that in retrospect tell you more than the loud bits. Ross pretended to be official. He read terms from a laminated sheet that smelled faintly of coffee, used phrases he didn't really understand. My neighbor, Ben, kept his hands on his truck like he expected to be punched, not helped. A woman across the street pointed her phone and tried to angle the camera like a prosecutor preparing evidence. People were hungry for drama. I think that's why Marla leaned in. She liked the sound of herself when the neighborhood listened. I had two choices: let it go and watch a line be crossed, or act in a way that might make a mess. I chose the latter. I walked up, and I spoke straight. I named the law without theatrics. I told them impersonating an officer is a felony, explained that detainment isn't their right, and then, because people tend to believe what they're already committed to believe, I did the only risky thing left. I made them uncomfortable enough to reveal the truth. Hank's hand slid toward his vest, and then stopped when I didn't flinch. Ross tried to grin like a man holding a gun, and his smile broke on the edge of my steady look. Part of the art of a confrontation is forcing small inconsistencies to become big cracks. A cuff that clinks when you talk about felony, a badge turned the wrong way, a name that doesn't check out. Those are the little things that let a crowd decide who to trust. Ross fumbled his badge. Hank's voice hitched. Marla, seeing the tide change, tried to double down, said louder that she had authority, that she'd called legal counsel already. That's when Ben's neighbor Diane, who'd been knitting on her porch every morning for 20 years, finally shouted, "You ain't no cop." And then the sound the whole block had been holding, the one that decides whether people keep smiling politely or stand up, released like a sigh. Ross lunged when he thought he had the upper hand. It was the impulse of a man who'd rehearsed aggression and expected it to work, but it was clumsy, like a child swinging at a wasp. I moved because my body remembered the math before my mind did. 1, 2, 3, and I used his momentum to guide him down, not to hurt him, just to remove his threat. There's a difference between force and finesse. One leaves scars, the other tells a story. I ended up with Ross's arm behind him, his cheap badge clattering into the grass, and a silence so loud you could hear the neighbor's dog finally bark. Then I did the thing that would have looked like arrogance in another story. I pulled out my old credentials, not as a flex, but as the final note of truth. I was law enforcement in a past life, I said gently. It wasn't a revelation so much as setting facts straight. The officers who showed up later would verify it, and I didn't need them in that moment. I needed Marla to see that the performance she bought with her money had collapsed under its own cheapness. Police arrived because someone dialed, and the scene was a little too much for polite Sunday. Officers took statements, used real authority that changes things in a way that fake authority can't. Ross and Hank were detained. Marla sat on the curb with her clipboard folded on her lap like a defeated flag. The neighbors who had been watching with popcorn mouths now had real faces: relief, embarrassment, triumph, curiosity. Ben hugged me like he'd been holding it together for years. Diane smiled, as if she'd been waiting for permission to be fierce. Afterward, the neighborhood divided in the way neighborhoods always do. Some defended Marla's structure. They said, mattered, rules kept chaos at bay. Others said the entire system needed to be looked at, that power without checks invites theater and, eventually, real harm. There were meetings, recorded calls, a flood of comments in our community forum, and letters that cited residents' rights and state statutes until the HOA office papered over with bureaucracy. Marla resigned from the board within a week, not because she'd been mean-hearted, but because the wheels of small power accountability finally caught up with her. Sitting on my porch that evening, a beer sweating in the sun, I thought about how easily people can become tools for someone else's insecurity. Marla hadn't set out to be a villain. She'd set out to be relevant, and in that reaching she made a choice that hurt others. Ross and Hank weren't masterminds. They were actors in a cheap play that spiraled. And we, the neighbors, the watchers, the ones who could have stepped forward earlier, we were a part of it too. Because community is the sum of what we tolerate. This isn't a story where the hero rides into the sunset with a badge and a moral lecture. It's quieter than that. It's about remembering that ordinary people can do the right thing when they refuse to let a bad script run unchallenged. It's about how small acts of courage, a neighbor's shout, a steady voice, a hand that guides rather than strikes, change the scene more effectively than a spectacle ever could. It's about how power, when left unchecked, grows teeth, and how we keep those teeth harmless is by being louder with our ethics than with our fear. So now I want to know what you do, not to get me to judge you, but because these stories don't end on a street corner. They keep going in comment threads, over kitchen tables, in HOA meetings that never stop feeling like trials. Tell me, where should the line be between neighborhood rules and personal freedom? When an authority looks official but isn't, how should a community react?